Hello, my name's Mark Ashton. I'm Professor of Silviculture at Yale University. And in this topic, we're going to talk about pine, and in particular, eastern white pine silviculture in southern New England. Now, what's really important to recognize is largely all the pine, in fact, this particular stand that you see here, established as a tapestry of what we define as old field pine, primarily in the 1850s, on the more marginal land that was abandoned first. It's only more recently some of the best lands and the best fertile arable fields that have started to become abandoned as agriculture has waned in southern New England. But here again, you have old field pine. This was the dominant forest type, the dominant stand type of New England during that period from the 1850s all the way up to the 1930s. Large areas of land moved back, field by field, to old field pine. One of the few trees that, one, was not browsed. Most livestock, deer, ungulates did not like it. Two, was if there was a nearby pine tree, could essentially establish in the thick sod, the thick grassy sod of the pasture. So the seed is actually of white pine, very drought tolerant. It's radical, a small little primary root that grows into the grass sod, is capable of withstanding pretty desiccating competitive interactions with the roots of the grass itself and penetrate into the mineral soil, which many of the small seeded angiosperms can't do. So that's another advantage that white pine has. And the second advantage is many of the nut dispersing species of the hardwoods have poor dispersal capacity. No squirrel in their right mind would be dispersing and burying nuts, acorns, hickories, chestnuts in the middle of a field. Very susceptible to predators. They need cover. So there were a number of advantages to why pine and pine monodominance came back in this particular climate. In other climates throughout eastern North America, you'll find other gymnosperms dominating. Up in the Maritimes, it's spruce. Further south, it's eastern red cedar. Further south, it becomes the southern pines, all the way down to Caribbean pine and then in Central America. So it's a novel way that nature, through relay heuristics, is essentially self-healing itself back into underneath. When this shades out, eventually second growth hardwood forest comes back in. But today's topic is about white pine silviculture. And much of the silviculture that was essentially practiced when schools of forestry were starting was around pine, because this is what was dominating the landscape in eastern North America. It still is in a minority component of landscapes today. And so here is a young old field pine stand. It's about 20 years old. It is coming in thick as a rain shadow, a seed shadow from nearby seed sources. It can come in fairly patchily too. But in this phenomena, what do you do? What are some of the tactics that you can do in terms of managing white pine, particularly for saw timber? So in the next few stops, we're going to be talking about release treatments and low thinnings, crop tree thinnings, and then how do we regenerate? And how do we regenerate pine to get back pine on the right sites versus allowing pine going back to what was originally there, hardwoods. In this case, second growth hardwoods. So, old field pine. What are the first considerations when you have densely stocked old field pine? Well, pine itself is tremendously productive, particularly in southern New England. And if one can grow clear timber, it has very high value, pruned timber. So one of the biggest, earliest returns that we have learned, published by Dave Smith and a lot of his colleagues, is that if you prune pine early, at the stage of release, during pole stage, when the crowns have receded in this very dark stem exclusion stand, the crowns are definitely in recession now, this is the ideal time to really pick your crop trees that will go to the end of the rotation, select them, prune them, and then do a cleaning release, taking out their nearest competitors in terms of canopy that would be considered dominant or co-dominant, leaving all the rest in the subcanopy and understory intact. So this would be a pruning with a cleaning release treatment in terms of proper definitions of silvicultural terminology that you have here. The orange trees that you see demarcated would be the trees that we have identified for the first stage of pruning. And the blue trees, those would be our crops trees. And the blue trees would be the trees that we would take out through a pre-commercial release treatment, a cleaning, in which we would essentially kill those trees through girdling. Girdling with stem injection herbicide is the most efficient way. So what you see here, this is an ideal time to prune, is because all the branches are dead. So the actual boles of the tree are intact but healed over and having closed through callus the wound tissue of the dead branches. So all you can do is brush them off, or brash them off in Scotland, in the UK is the term, but you would be basically just knocking them off because they're dead. Don't have to worry about any kind of particular kind of live pruning in this circumstance. So it's ideal. You're really minimizing any kind of infection or injury that you would be creating when you do this. And at the same time, you're doing it when the tree is small enough to really allow for the whole rotation to grow clear white pine timber for saw timber. So it is a very large, important, particular incremental value that you can really add early on to a stand, is just by pruning a select number to carry forth to the end of the rotation. So those are the orange trees, which means that you're basically having to take out the competition. So you've pruned these trees, you've invested in these trees, you look up at the canopy, they're healthy, you've got a straight bole, they've been guided through self-thinning, through the stem exclusion stage, they put on a clear 16 foot, we've pruned to 8 foot in this case. And so for the rest of their life, at least for the first 16 foot and probably for the next 16 feet, you've got both a straight timber that you can prune up as the crown recedes. But you have to ensure that they survive. If you're going to invest in them, you're going to have to do release cleanings. And so that means taking out the nearest competitors, generally more limby, more malformed, often through what's called a beetle that basically, it's called the white pine weevil. The larvae of the beetle the female lays its egg in the terminal apical main stem up right at the crown, and then the beetle essentially, the eggs hatch, and then they girdle the stem, and so a new stem, a lateral branch, takes off. And so actually you can see some of the trees that we selected, such as this one here, where the weevil has affected the tree several times in the past. So this is a tree that you'd probably take out. It's quite healthy, but it's not going to be a great timber tree, and it's competing with the crop tree that you have here. And so in this case, just a simple hack in and then a squirt with some stem injection herbicide is effective in reducing and taking these out with minimal cost. Logistically, it's fairly feasible. You're just going to try and mark maybe 60 trees per acre at most in terms of crop trees, and you're going to probably take out another 60 to 90 trees that are directly competing. And this is really in accordance with another aspect, Reinecke's self-thinning index. And we can use Reinecke's self-thinning index in this particular stand. I won't explain it in this particular video, but see my other video for application of Reinecke's self-thinning index. If you know what the diameter and the density of the trees are now, you can calculate out where they are in terms of self-thinning, and as when you look around, you can see that there's absolutely nothing on the ground. This is maximum. There's an enormous amount of branches. There's actually a lot of mortality going on among the overtopped or intermediate crown classes of white pine. And so this is way overstocked. And so you can look at Reinecke's stand density index, and it will also give you a guide as to, okay, maybe I want to have and achieve 10-inch diameter white pine as a tree where I can do my first commercial thinning. How many trees do I have to have? That index will allow you to define how many crop trees you'd have to have per acre. You can select how many crop trees you have now, and then they will grow, free to grow, up to that self-thinning curve, Reinecke's self-density index, and that will allow you free to grow trees that will grow consistently without coming back in again to do any kind of release treatment. But here again, in New England, this is the approximate way you go about definitely doing release treatments in white pine. It's a very important way, particularly putting on as much value on pruned white pine of straight form that you can, and it will carry to the first commercial crown thinning, and then eventually to your regeneration method, or to the end of the rotation, whatever you decide to do at the end, or to your first heavy low thinning. So that's what we're going to go and have a look at next. Stop 3. So this is stop 3, and here you can do your first commercial thinning. Most of all the trees that you're looking at in this white pine, old-field white pine, is that the ages vary between 40 and 45 to 50 years in age, and it's had a release treatment, it's had a pruning. The trees marked in orange are your crop trees. They've received a pruning and a cleaning 30-odd years ago, and so what you're looking at now is the first commercial thinning that you could do, and the best way you could work with this is in 2 ways. It's a relatively simple monodominant stand. It's mostly all old field pine, but there are occasional hardwoods. And you'll see, for example, this tree here is an aspen that we purposely left primarily for wildlife value as a hardwood element within a stand that might go back, if we choose to, and we can in terms of the appropriate site, back to white pine and white pine regeneration. In any event, it leaves choice for us later when it comes time to regenerating the stand. But most of it is all white pine. And so we have 2 ways of working with this. If we have a pulpwood market, there's no harm in doing a heavy low thinning for a lot of the smaller diameter trees, moving right up into the canopy and just leaving the crop trees, the trees marked in orange. That's if you have both a saw timber and a pulpwood market. And you're not really changing the actual diversity of the stand, primarily because the hardwoods are not back in yet. And there is no hardwoods or any other species other than pine in the stand. And so when you're doing a low thinning, you're just taking out pine to favor other pine. So you're not really favoring the successional trajectory in terms of species composition in these kinds of stands, unlike what we've been talking about in terms of second growth hardwoods. Second growth hardwoods, I would say a low thinning is a big no-no, because you are taking out the species mixtures that allows you to make sure that you have trees of the future stand dynamic, successional dynamic, sugar maples beneath oak that you might be taking out, or trees of the past stand dynamic that might be added structures and legacies when it comes time to regenerate the whole stand. So low thinnings are not appropriate for mixed second growth hardwood stands, in my opinion, even aged. But low thinnings where you have markets are appropriate for pine, sort of old field pine stands. But if you don't have the market, you just have a saw timber market, then the most appropriate way to go about thinning is to take out just the largest co-dominant and dominant competitors and leave everything else out. Just leave it here to grow, because really it's not interfering in this ever moist, wet climate. It's not really interfering in terms of light or moisture. So when you're looking at these orange marked crop trees, the trees that you might take out in these circumstances might be this tree here, which is commercially viable, or you might be also taking out this tree here, or this tree here. You have various choices. Yet generally in a light crown thinning, you're taking out every other tree competing with the actual crop tree. But in a heavy crown thinning, you might be taking 2 trees for every crop tree. So it really depends upon how you want to facilitate and how you want to free up growing space. The more growing space you free up, the more inefficient it is in terms of total stand productivity. But you are providing more growing space to the individual trees that you leave behind to continue to usurp that growing space for a longer period of time and more rapidly. So that would be the next stage in treating old field pine. So this is an example of a very heavy, low thinning, where if you look carefully, all the trees marked in blue, those were originally all those pruned crop trees way back 40 years ago. Now you're looking at a 45, 50-year-old stand, the same sort of stand that you saw previously in our stop in which we demonstrated how you think about doing a crown thinning or a crop tree thinning. Here is a heavy, low thinning, and in this circumstance, all the trees that are marked in blue are the original crop trees that are now left standing, and all the smaller trees, so thinning from below, have been removed. And so this can go on for another 10, 15 years, and the trees can perhaps increase by 1/3 in size dramatically with all this growing space. This is if you treat it as a thinning, a heavy low thinning. I know people will ask me, but Dr. Ashton, this looks like the first cut, preparatory establishment cut of a shelterwood. And it could be interpreted that way if you intend to regenerate and to perhaps scarify the soil. You can see all the woody debris might need to be treated here to open up and expose the soil to really facilitate a lot more white pine regeneration. White pine regeneration is definitely going to come back in on this sort of site. This has only been harvested 2 years ago. So it's definitely going to come in the next mast year. But if we treat this as a thinning, then the canopy is going to close back, and the white pine that establishes is going to get overtopped and suppressed and sit there. It'll sit there as advanced regeneration. And then you have the choice, maybe 10, 15 years down the road, after the thinning is treated, to start regenerating it. And you could regenerate it through just the removal cutting or the establishment cutting of a shelterwood, leaving a regular shelterwood where you could leave trees behind, or just take off the canopy and leave reserves behind, structures behind that you might want in terms of creating structural diversity for both wildlife attributes and for perhaps there is other species that you might want to leave behind as reserves in terms of the hardwoods, as in the previous stop we talked about aspen. So in our interpretation, this is a low thinning because the canopy is going to seal over, the trees are going to grow much bigger, and we're going to leave this over a much longer period of time. We're not intending to regenerate. If we are intending to regenerate, this could be interpreted, if you did some sort of site treatment to scarify and establish regeneration, as the first preparatory and establishment cutting of a shelterwood. So, last time we talked about a heavy low thinning. That was our last stop. But there's an alternative. We can work with crown thinnings for old field pine too. Commercial crown thinnings, in which we're just taking out every other large tree and not doing a thinning from below. We're just taking out the codominance and dominance of our competing crop trees, and these are marked in blue. The remaining trees, you can see there's a lot of smaller trees just left behind. Why did we leave them? And why do we choose to do a crown thinning here and a heavy low thinning over there? The reason is to do with the purity of the pine. If we have a lot of hardwoods that are coming up of different kinds of size classes, species combinations, is probably a nice way of incorporating and leaving them in the structure. And many of them are smaller. Things like cherry, the sugar maple, and all these small saplings that you see are all sugar maple, and the red maple. These are all hardwood components of the lower strata that we would take out in a heavy low thinning, but leaving them as a crown thinning provides greater structural diversity, greater species diversity, and greater choice at the end of our sort of rotation as to make a choice as to whether we want to go back into pine, if we can, on the right site, or move it into some sort of hardwood regeneration, either in an irregular way or in an even-aged way. So, what do you want to do when you want to regenerate the stand, pine, after maybe several sort of crown thinnings or several heavy low thinnings, back to pine? Well, one caveat. If you remember, much of that old field pine grew primarily on old fields that were originally hardwood sites. Pine, where it really dominates, it's not to say it can't coexist with hardwood, it does in intimate mixture, but where pine really dominates as sort of monodominant stands are on what we call pine sites, which are sandy, gravelly, outwash sites. So if you want to successfully regenerate pine, the best is to basically ensure that you can easily do that without much pushing or herbicide and the least amount of sort of release work. You can really easily get pine back without much hardwood competition on these sandy, dry, gravelly glacial outwash sites. And this is one example. This is an irregular white pine sea tree that you see here. This was actually a 60-year-old stand. In other words, remember, we were prying our crop tree and our crown and our heavy low thinnings in stands for around 45 years, and we could progress up and we could make a decision as to whether we wanted to do shelterwood, or in many cases we can go into sea tree on the right site, on these glacial outwash sandy sites, perfect for pine. So this was a 60-year-old stand which we started regenerating 20 years ago. And now you're looking at basically 20 years worth of young pine establishment, and it was a seed tree, it's already had the removal of the canopy, and what remains are trees that we have purposely left behind. They might, if it was a timber company, they wouldn't be left behind. They're enormously valuable. But from our own university standpoint, we're leaving them as structural reserves to grow even bigger. So these are now 70-year-old pine that you're looking at. They're over 1 meter in size. And these are some of the fastest, most productive sites that we have in eastern southern New England. 60-year type rotations for pine as compared to somewhere around 80 to 100 or 120, depending upon the quality of the hardwood site for second growth hardwoods. So it is definitely one of the most productive sites, both in terms of standing basal area and in terms of the productivity of the site for pine to grow. And so you're looking at 20-year-old regeneration where we are about to, not quite because you can see the crowns haven't receded yet, but it's in stem exclusion, it'll soon be time to go back into that same sequence that we talked about previously. Time to go back in to do a selective cleaning, release cleaning, in which we prune particular crop trees that we select and clean around them, taking out judiciously just competing trees and leaving the rest. Not quite time yet, but this is a great example of an irregular seed tree leaving large trees behind. And those seed trees, in terms of wildlife, have enormously important value, particularly in terms of, we've discovered pine warblers just residing in just 1 or 2 trees. And they're a very, very habitat-specific species of bird. Also, in terms of nesting habitat for some of the large raptors, very important. These kinds of pines are very important for predatory birds like goshawks that we have here, or some of the other soaring hawks, broadleaf hawks, and sometimes red-shouldered hawks. So this is how we regenerate pine. It's a cycle, but now with the second growth hardwoods coming back up, we're managing pine on more restricted sites, in monodominant stands on the most productive sites. And we're also managing and incorporating pine into our second growth hardwood, but not as monodominant stands.